All right. Thank you everybody for coming to a new Maui Athletics Live Q&A. We've got a lot of really good questions for you here today. For people that are filtering in throughout this, if you want to say hi, if you want to ask any questions, make sure to unmute yourself. It'll be able to, allow you to say something. But otherwise, we've got a lot of really good questions lined up. And let's get to them so we can get to as many as possible because based on the number of questions that we have here, there's no way that we're going to be able to get to all of these, but I'm certainly going to answer any of the live ones that people have, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And any extra that we do end up having, I'm going to get to in next week. So, starting things off, electrolytes for moderately low sodium intakes. Do they help? My doctor has recommended electrolytes for me based on low sodium in blood tests. So, if you have low sodium in blood tests, this is not something that I would really be looking at a supplement to to rectify. What I would start doing is I would start putting some salt on your foods. I mean, season your foods to taste. This is going to be a really beneficial thing for you from overall just enjoying your food a little bit more, and being able to have some more nice nutrition involved. If for some reason you just hate the taste of salt, I mean, the best thing that you could possibly do if you just want a base, there's something called light salts, Lite. And that is a nice combination of potassium and sodium. And it's kind of like another version of, how like iodized salts are a way to supplement some iodine in many people. This is a way to get some extra potassium. So if you're on a diet that is very low calorie, and you might find that getting potassium in your diet is a difficult thing, light salts are a really great way to improve both sodium and potassium balance, which are both necessary for hydration and water regulation within the body. So, my number one recommendation for this type of thing is if you have a low sodium blood test, it's probably best to just start seasoning your foods. And I know that that can be a scary thing for us when we're just trying to get into this. But this is something that will, a lot of times people will think, well, if I'm adding all these different things like salt, am I not going to bloat up? Initially, particularly if you are very low on hydration to begin with, well, one, you should be getting more water in your daily intake. But two, yes, you could have a little bit of a bloating phase within the first couple of weeks as you add some sodium in, but that's okay. Make sure that you're getting in water, and this will all balance itself out. And if you have the light salts that have that extra potassium, that's even easier for your body to balance out. So this is something that I would keep in mind whenever you're starting to do this, but I would not go out of my way to find a specific electrolyte supplement because one, it's going to cost you a lot extra. Two, it's not really going to give you the benefits that you think you're going to be getting from it. And three, you're probably going to benefit more from light salts, which will have a better potassium to sodium content anyways. Okay, next question. Band pull aparts. Thumbs facing out or thumbs facing in. Whenever I program these for people, and Beth is the same way, we like to use the thumbs out method. So you grab the rope and you're pulling out, as opposed to having your hands in and pulling apart. I like thumbs out, knuckles forward when you're pulling, because in the majority of the movements that we do every single day, and in the majority of the movements that we do in the gym, we have an internal rotation to our shoulders. This will cause an external rotation, which is a really good thing to be working as well. It aids in prehab and rehab, and helps to strengthen your shoulder in a plane or in a movement that is not typically done. And so, can you do them in the different positioning? Can you do them this way? Yes, you can. Are you going to get some distinct benefits doing it this way? Yes, you are. And the movements like this are probably going to be covered by a variety of other exercises that you do, which is why we tend to do it the way that we do it, because we know that we're probably deficient in that externally rotated shoulder movement. Collagen. Thoughts, benefits both performance and cosmetic. Now, this is a great question, and this is one of those ones that is going to be very controversial depending on who you talk to. And I'll give you my stance, and I'll say essentially right now we don't know. But the better data seems to suggest that collagen is probably worthless to buy. Collagen, bone broth, beef protein isolate all fall into the same categories because they're extremely deficient in a lot of the amino acids that we would really want, like leucine and some of the other branched chain amino acids. And it's basically all glycine, proline, hydroxyproline. So the theory was if these things like proline and glycine are used in joints, then if we take more in, then our joints will have more fuel to essentially stay healthy, to repair, all that type of stuff. The thing is, in initial studies, particularly for cosmetics, the skin, hair, nails, there wasn't an objective measurement. They would say, hey, look, we're going to let you take this, and then you tell us whether or not you think your skin or your hair looks better. And people would say yes or no. So there's no objective measure to it. It's a very subjective measure. When we first started looking at the joint information, the problem with a lot of these things is you're probably going to get a lot of um, subjective experience in play, which means you're going to get a lot of placebo effects happening. And so when you would give somebody something and you would say, hey, does this feel better with your joints? A lot of times people would say yes, and it would kind of muddy those waters. So we've started using something called deuterated water in research. And deuterated water allows us to track connective tissue synthesis, connective protein tissue synthesis. This should be increasing if we're in a situation where it's helping to repair the joints, because it's that connective tissue that needs to be built. When we're looking at collagen data currently and we're using the better tracking methods, we don't see this connective tissue synthesis ramping up, which tells us that most likely the benefits that people thought they were getting from collagen is probably placebo, or might be related to the fact that collagen is a protein. It's a very deficient source of protein, but it's a protein nonetheless. And so even though it's a deficient source of protein, when they were giving this to like elderly people, which is where we see the most benefit, when they were giving this to elderly people, they would show benefits, but it might be because the elderly people just don't eat any protein. And so giving them anything was better than nothing. And so the question would be, well, in under the same conditions, if we just gave them whey protein, would they have the same benefits, if not more? And the answer right now is probably. So we're looking at collagen right now, and anybody that is really pushing it hard tends to be somebody that has a discount code for it. And there's a lot of people that I know that are friends of mine that are respected people that still push collagen. But even when I talk with them about this kind of thing, they don't really have an answer for this discussion. They're just like, oh, okay. You're like, right. So like, do we still push this? And so, from my perspective, as somebody that when I recommend things to you, I want to have a better than not chance of it really being worth your money, can't recommend collagen protein at this time. In fact, any situation where you're probably going to use collagen protein, I would argue that whey is probably a better choice. So, or any other kind of complete protein. I mean, even soy protein isolate's probably a better choice. Casein is probably a better choice. Egg protein isolate's probably a better choice. I would avoid beef protein isolate, bone broth, and collagen for now until we get better information. And if we start to get more and more information in the future that suggests that this is something that's really beneficial for us, then I'll change my mind. But until that happens, I'm not really comfortable telling people to spend money on a product that is pushed significantly by supplement companies because the source material costs nothing and they can charge a good amount for it. So this is one of those supplements. Like whey protein makes almost no money for the people that are selling it. The margins on it are very, very small. The margins on collagen protein are extremely high. And so there's a lot of push by the manufacturers to sell it because it makes a lot of money. And so that in combination with really kind of piss poor research supporting it makes me question whether or not we should be pushing this as professionals. So there's my answer there. Can you tell us how alcohol affects muscle growth? So alcohol affects muscle growth in a lot of different ways. It affects men more than it affects women. Um, but the issue with alcohol is it goes beyond the calorie amounts that are part of it. And anybody that works with me in a one-on-one coaching scenario knows that we have a free calorie allotment for the day. Because if we take up the majority of your nutrition with whole minimally processed foods, you've got some room for some more indulgent type foods. Like you can fit 125 calories of chocolate per day for most people if you want to. So I've got a free calorie allotment that I give people as a discretionary calorie intake that allows them to have everything that they want within that because it teaches you both this is okay to have within a moderated amount. Not no food is good or bad. But there are two caveats that I have to this when I work with clients, and this goes along with this whole how alcohol affects you beyond its calorie amount. Because if it was just the calories, you could fit this and it wouldn't be a problem. The issue with alcohol itself, and that's one of the caveats, is that I typically tell people don't use alcohol for this free calorie allotment. One, having 125, 150 calories or more of alcohol per day could be considered a drinking problem. And so this is an issue in and of itself. On top of that, it has some wide-ranging effects on hormones, testosterone in particular, and in men that are significant drinkers, it can lower it by more than 50%. The effects that alcohol causes can last up to 48 hours or so after ingestion, and it not only essentially tanks testosterone levels, it massively impairs muscle protein synthesis. So if you're a woman that says, well, testosterone going down a little bit, or 15% of not a large pool is still not that much of a loss. The problem is the muscle protein synthesis issue, the protein utilization issues are still very apparent in women. And so you'll find that women that tend to drink more often, this is one of the reasons that, in men, this is one of the reasons that we have that skinny fat appearance, because even if you're losing weight, you're losing more muscle and less body fat. And conversely, if you're gaining weight, you're gaining more fat and less muscle. And so this is one of those things that attributes directly to really bad body composition if you're doing this often. And now I'm not trying to scare anybody. If you're somebody that, you have one or two drinks a weekend, it's probably not going to majorly negatively affect you. Are there benefits to alcohol? No, there are no benefits outside of what you could argue is like a better social life in some experiences. But I would say, yes, use this if this can help you with your social life, but really make these social outings mostly about the time that you spend with friends and not about drinking or eating. And you'll have a much better life because you're going to have a much easier time sticking to these health outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So certainly there can be celebrations that this makes a lot of sense. That doesn't mean that necessarily every weekend you're going to want to, go balls to the wall and drinking alcohol because of the wide-ranging effects that it has. And because of the fact that it can hit you in a multitude of ways. I mean, it can increase cancer risk. It can cause these issues with muscle protein synthesis. It unbalances quite a bit of hormones. It lowers your inhibitions. And so when you're in these drinking situations, you're probably much more likely to be off plan in your eating beyond what the alcohol itself causes. So there's just a bunch of wide-ranging effects that this can have. And if you really want to make a lifelong change, this is one of those areas that I don't tell people that you have to cut out completely, but you should probably look at and minimize as best as possible. And that amount that you minimize is going to be balanced. You find where you want your social life and your drinking life, and you find where you want your health and your physique. You cannot have both at maximal levels, but you can find that right balance for you, and it's different for each person. And so, me saying, hey, I drink one or two drinks every 2 weeks might be right for me. That might be the right choice for you every week. And it could be that, and that's okay. Let's just not confuse ourselves into thinking that there's this massive health benefit from drinking these types of things and that there aren't some of these negatives, because there have been a lot of kind of miscommunications about some potential benefits. And the big one that comes out usually is like red wine and polyphenols. The problem is polyphenols, yes, have benefits. Resveratrol and some of those other things have benefits, but they are usually seen at much higher dosages than you get in like a glass of alcohol. And the negatives from that glass of wine are far higher than the benefits that you get. So I would never look at this as, okay, good, I'm doing good for my health by drinking this red wine. You're not. You are choosing as an adult to have this consciously, and that's okay in certain situations. As long as you're okay with that, as long as you're okay with the potential outcomes that can come from that, it's a perfectly fine choice. Getting close to meeting my goals. Any tips on maintenance? Yes, maintenance is tougher than losing body fat or building the muscle in the first place. And this is one of those things that I think really just blows people's minds quite a bit, because they think that the journey to get there is always the hardest thing. And then once they're there, it's all, sunshine and rainbows. And it can be if along that journey to get there, you are building the habits, coping mechanisms, and routines that can allow you to stay stable. And if you're doing that, that's great. This kind of goes back to some of that conversation that we've had over the past couple of weeks where people bring up GLP-1s and they're not forming these habits and routines. And so this is why, if you look at the research on GLP-1s, the second people go off, they almost always regain all the weight. And this is again the same conversation that we had last week where I said this is why if you're going to go on a GLP-1 and you're truly indicated for it, you should have the expectation that you're going to be on it for the rest of your life. While you're doing that, you should be building the habits and routines and coping mechanisms that are necessary to be able to handle this as best as possible. In case you choose to wean yourself off of those drugs, because it's going to be necessary to be able to manage it. And this falls back into the same realm as tips for maintenance. You're going to want to learn to find that balance in the, types of indulgent foods that you have, in the balance of being okay with some hunger levels and for the people that follow me on Instagram, I just talked about eating and hunger literally yesterday in my reel. And that's a very important thing. Accepting that hunger may be part of your life is very important. And, adjusting the foods that you choose, more high fiber, more lean proteins is a really important thing. More veggies is going to be very important. But learning to accept that some of these changes are lifelong is the really important thing. And if you go into maintenance with the right expectations of, okay, if you're trying to lose body fat, this entire journey of losing body fat is going to feel like you're putting in a lot of effort because you're trying to do things that you've never done before. You're changing the habits that you've done. You're changing the eating patterns that you've had for decades. Well, you're going to have to keep that up when you're at maintenance. You're just going to eat more of what you were eating before. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're eating, pizzas 2 or 3 days a week. You're still probably eating pizza once every couple of weeks or every few weeks like you were during the cutting phases, but you're still largely eating the same types of foods that you did during the journey to get where you wanted to be, because that's how you maintain where you want to be. The lean proteins, the veggies, all those different types of things. When you start to accept the fact that when I get to maintenance, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden I can go back to my old eating patterns or my old movement habits or my old gym habits, your life becomes a lot easier. And so I bring this up now because if you can accept that when the journey is starting and you can really have a buy-in to learning those habits, routines, and the fact that this is a big lifestyle change, all of a sudden, maintenance goes from the hardest thing in the world to being a very clean, easy transition. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for some indulgent foods. There is certainly room for some indulgent foods at certain times, but you have the right expectations, and that becomes the exception rather than the rule, which is different than what we've usually done growing up. All right. Are wild fish better than farm raised? Um, this is always kind of a tricky question because when people ask this question, that you can certainly point to research suggesting that, hey, we've got different levels of chemicals and things. We've got different levels of omega-3s. We've got different levels of this or that. The major differences don't seem to be that big in an absolute sense. So rather than worrying about whether you have wild fish, farm raised, or whatever it is, focus more on the fact that you're eating whole, minimally processed foods. If you do that, your life will be a lot easier. There is a much better lifestyle, even eating farm raised fish, than eating McDonald's every day. And so give yourself some grace, go with what you can afford, go with what is readily available for you, and let all of that minutia stuff off to the side because any practical differences that this is going to make is either non-existent or so small it's not even worth worrying about. I mean, really focus on the big rocks. And that's the biggest thing in any of these fitness journeys that I think that people really need to get into is learning to focus on the big rocks. And I know that that can be extremely difficult in the way that the internet puts these things out these days. Because anytime you see like a podcast or anytime you see a reel or a TikTok, they're always focusing on the minutia. And they're focusing on the minutia because the minutia gets you to listen, but it's not what actually gets you to your goals. Really make sure that you're mastering the basics with training, really make sure that you're mastering the basics with nutrition, sleep, and stress relief. And if you do those four things, it's going to bring you where you need to be. And then that means that these things like farm raised beef or like grass fed beef versus grain fed beef, the wild versus farm raised fish, none of these things really matter in the grand scheme. The differences are so small. And what's really funny is when they talk to you about these things, just like with the grass fed versus grain fed, they'll say, "Hey, look, this has 200% or 500% more omega-3s." But then you realize that the omega-3s, even with the 500% more, only accounts for 1%. If you take a serving of that beef, is only 1% of your daily intake. And so the differences don't really matter when you look at the absolute amounts. So again, focus on the important things, If you've got any questions about that, certainly put those questions up in Mighty Networks, and we can give you some information to put things into context so you can stop worrying about this stuff. I mean, this journey is it's very simple, but it's not easy. And when you cut out a lot of these different things in your life that makes things more difficult, that's when this becomes significantly better. So, going back a question, I just looked at the chat. David asked, "Does testosterone drop with just one glass of wine?" Yes, it does. But the relative amount is much smaller than if this is a frequent thing. And so obviously the frequency with which you use this and the amount with which you do this at one time is significantly affects this. But it will drop testosterone significantly, just any alcohol. I mean, it does. It messes with your body pretty badly. But even more so than that, it's probably protein synthesis is probably what I would look out for most if I was just going to have like, one glass. I wouldn't worry about testosterone being, killed entirely. But this kind of brings up another idea there that, another one of the effects that alcohol has is it lowers sleep quality, and that significantly affects body composition and testosterone production too. So this is a multi-headed thing with how dramatically this can affect you from so many different angles. Should I work out if I'm still sore from a previous workout? So assuming that assuming that you're not so sore that it feels like you can't possibly move, yes, you probably should. And especially if you first started working out, if you first started getting into the gym, you're going to be more sore than you otherwise would. And so this is one of those things that the more that you start to do this, the easier it's going to get. So yes, you should be getting in to the gym, and this is one of those parts where it's just part of the journey itself. And staying lightly active is something that can be very beneficial here because it can it can allow you to relieve some of that soreness. And as you become more and more adapted to the gym, this kind of soreness goes away anyway. So if you're excessively sore, that means to look back over your training. Hopefully, you're doing iron core training with us because we help to kind of keep this within boundaries. But if you are and you're excessively sore, that just means that you need to lower the volume that you're doing. So if you're doing if we say 3 to 5 sets, you should probably be doing three and then build up over time, especially if you're first starting out. And that's actually one of the reasons that we have these ranges that we do in the programming. One, it allows for people to make adjustments based off of the time that they have available. But two, it also allows you to make adjustments based off of experience level. And more experienced people and people with more time may have more volume in their programs, and that's perfectly fine. The lowest volume in the programs will work, and it will work exceptionally well for beginners and people short on time. The higher end of the volume is the other end of the stage. And this is one of the ways that we make these adjustments for people of varying experience levels. Um, Vibration plates and lymphatic system benefits. Really? So I have no idea where this came from, the vibration plate thing, because this is one of those things that it was big in like the 50s, and now all of a sudden it's back, and I have no idea why it came back. And I'm sure that there was some stupid special somewhere. No, it does not do anything. Vibration plates, I mean, if we're going to talk about movement as being beneficial, just go for a walk, please. These vibration plates aren't going to do anything as far as this goes. Easy answer for that one. Okay. Um, How to deal with eating way over calories at night, compliant through the day, hitting my macros. Well, if you're talking about your way over during the nighttime, well, then that suggests that you're not hitting your macros. And so what I would do is I would look to what types of foods are you choosing and when are you choosing to eat them. So if you're telling me right now, um, you're overeating at night, then why don't we do something like an intermittent fasting style routine? Now, I've talked before about how there's no specific benefits to fasting itself. It's all due to the calorie deficit that's created, but there's benefits in timing for things like hunger. And if you're consistently hungry at the end of the day, why don't we position more calories towards that end of the day? Maybe that's the normal eating pattern that you have. And so you can choose not to eat until 11, 12, 1 p.m. and then have all of your calories for that day in that latter half. And this is going to be specific to the person because the research suggests that a large majority of people have more hunger in the morning. But just like you, I'm that same way. I've got more hunger in the evening. So I don't typically eat until like 10 a.m. And that works for me. It helps me maintain body weight and body composition. So if you've got some issues with overeating at night, that's where you start to do this. And I also want you to be conscious of the fact that there's hedonic eating and that there is, a physical type of hunger. Hedonic eating comes on very quickly. It's focused on things like the sensations involved, taste, the texture, the experience that you're going to have. It doesn't usually get involved with things like hunger pangs. Like if you're physically hungry, you have hunger pangs. And so one of the best things that you can do is you can ask yourself a simple question, which I like to call the apple test. And you say, hey, look, I'm really hungry right now. Would an apple solve this craving? If the answer is hell no, an apple wouldn't solve this craving, I want donuts. Well, you've just answered for yourself that this is not a physical hunger because when it's a physical hunger, literally anything that will fill you up sounds pretty good. When it is a hedonic or emotional type of hunger, it's going to require specific food. It's going to have to be the donuts or the brownies or the whatever your comfort food is. And so when you ask yourself, would an apple work or would a chicken breast work? And the answer is no, that gives you a lot of information that you can work with. So if the answer is no, the first thing that I would always do under these situations, and this works for any craving, whether or not it's at night, whether it's the morning, no matter the time of day, if you ask yourself this question, you figure out that this is a hedonic or emotional type of hunger, wait 20 minutes. Start an alarm, your phone, your watch, whatever it is. If you wait 20 minutes, most of the time these things will subside and pass. If after 20 minutes you still have that craving and you want to have it, well, then you can make the conscious choice and you are at least not pulled into this through emotion. And so that can be a really good thing because it can essentially give you the ability to have these foods without feeling as much guilt because you've started to take some time and ownership into this. And when you start to take control, you can be more comfortable with your choices. So I really want to emphasize the fact that as long as we have control over these situations, as long as our expectations match our actions, then we're going to be completely fine. And so maybe the expectation is, okay, I've waited 20 minutes. I still want to have this brownie. I'm okay with being up a pound in the next couple days. And that's a perfectly good choice. 100%. That's awesome. This is the way that you should be looking at food because you can have a brownie from time to time. But if you have, you know, 600 calories in brownies today and then you're upset that you gained a pound tomorrow, that's not the right thing to do. That means that your expectations and your actions are not aligned. This is where people get into trouble. And people really get into trouble in these situations where they say, okay, well, I really want to have that brownie. I didn't wait 20 minutes. I've had it. And then afterwards, you experience regret. If a food is making you experience regret minutes after having it, then that's an abusive relationship. And that should tell you something. But these are the type of things that sometimes keeping a food diary can really help with. And when people have these discordant hunger cues, they say, I'm really hungry in the evenings or whatever it is, a lot of times this has to do with something that you're experiencing. And a food diary can really give you some insights into how you can address this type of thing. So, a food diary, if you have a situation where you ever feel out of control or you feel like you've eaten in a manner that doesn't support what you're trying to become or the goals that you have, you take stock. You write down, okay, 10 p.m. I had a donut. Afterwards, I felt guilt. Okay, cool. You've noticed that. What was happening in the hours leading up to this? And if you keep a food diary long enough, you're going to start to notice some patterns. Oh, it happens every time I get back from work. And it happens every time after I put my kids to bed and they're very stressful when they're going to bed or whatever it is. But if you start to notice these triggers or you start to notice these habits or patterns in your life, that's the only time that you can start to make decisions to countermand those. And that's a good thing because you've learned whatever this bad habit is, which means you can also unlearn it. Now, you might not be able to adjust the trigger. You might not be able to get your kid to all of a sudden not act like a little dick when he's going to bed. You might not be able to get your boss to get off your back when you're getting home from work. But if you realize that these types of things are happening, you can change your response to it. And then maybe you reach for that apple. Maybe you occupy yourself with a productive task or something that you find enjoyable in your life. Any kind of meaningful activity or a healthier food substitution can work really well in these situations. Now, like I said before, this is not something to guilt you into never having a brownie, but it is to say if you're having these situations where it feels like it's difficult, this is what you reach towards because this gives you an actionable like habit change to do to be able to get out of this cycle. The food diary is the first start to that, and then addressing the way that you react to the triggers that you have is the second step. If you start to do that, your life will become a lot easier. This will make maintenance a lot easier. This even goes back to that first question that we talked about, where all of a sudden, you're at maintenance, but you've built up these habits, and now you're no longer relying on just willpower to, raw dog your way through life. And that's the difference between people that have their willpower work for them and the people that are always draining their battery and on empty. Does fat distribution change to different areas of body as women age? Yes. Yes, it does. When you go through menopause, the perimenopause transition, you will start to gain fat more centrally. This does not mean that the menopause change is the reason that you gain fat, but you do gain fat centrally around the midsection, viscerally, more than you ever have before in most women. Um, the good news is the same diets, routines, activity levels tend to work before as after, but it's more difficult. That transition period makes life a lot more difficult. You have the vasomotor symptoms. You can't sleep. You've got hot flashes. You've got all these other things that are working against you. Your activity levels are dropping without you even realizing. Your cravings are really going up. Like a lot of these things start to work against you. So the experience is very, very real. But if you're given the information that you need during these things, it makes it a lot easier. And knowing that you're not, your perception is not wrong. If you say, hey, man, I'm gaining, body fat in my stomach more than I've ever gained before. Yeah, you probably are if you're in a slight calorie surplus or you're moving less than what you were before. That change to where you gain it is very real. It seems that I'm generally weaker in my lifts after a cut. Why? Well, mass moves mass. And so if you're a smaller person, and usually after cuts, we're significantly smaller people, you're going to be able to move less mass. Um, you know, there's um, there's a reason that the strongest people in the world, the biggest strongmen are 400 pounds, because even if a guy lifted really, really heavy and is 250 pounds, he would never be able to keep up with them because size does matter. So if you are an untrained person, if you haven't really hit the weights a whole lot in your life and you're starting to hit the weights for the first time and you're losing body fat, you're probably going to get a lot stronger. Yes. If you're really experienced and you're going down in body weight. If you're really experienced with weight training, you're going down in body weight. You're probably at best going to hold steady, maybe gain a little bit, but in many cases, you're going to be lifting less. And that's just the way that it is. And so then you find that balance between, um, losing weight and the strength that you want to have over that, for your goals, because you're going to have to make that balance, just like you make the balance with things like alcohol, you're going to have to make that balance with things like strength. All right. Should people take a break from pre-workouts to desensitize themselves? Yes, you should. What ends up happening, this is one of those things that people used to get confused with this, and they would call this adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue is not a real thing, believe it or not. I know that this information has been out a long time, but even the longer that I talk about, fitness and nutrition, all these different types of things, I mean, there's still a lot of people that push this type of myth. Adrenal fatigue is not a thing. Adrenal insufficiency is a thing, but adrenal insufficiency is something like Addison's disease. And if you have that, you actually need to go to the doctor because it could kill you. So the issue with things like pre-workouts or coffee or caffeine or any other stimulants is that they cause your central adenosine receptors upregulate. And what that means is these things in your body start to grab more and more and more of those caffeine molecules. They start to grab the stimulants that are in your system. They're oriented at turning those off, because if you've ever never like if you've ever gone to the point where you haven't had caffeine in a long time and then you take like 300 milligrams at once and you're super jittery and your heart is racing, if your body didn't upregulate these central adenosine receptors, that's what would happen every time you had caffeine, and it would feel awful. And so your body says, okay, I've got this thing in my system that's not natural and I need to get rid of it. So it uses adenosine receptors to do that. Over time, more and more of those adenosine receptors get upregulated. So you've got more and more of these things that are grabbing the caffeine that comes in. That explains why over time you need to take in more and more caffeine to get the same effects. This is what's happening. It has nothing to do with your adrenals. Your adrenals, no problem there. The only way to really cause issues with the adrenals is to physically denervate them or to use some kind of like medication or something like that. Physically denervating them could mean you get the area of your brain gets cut and it causes a problem with your adrenals. The maybe a tumor gets pressed up against it and it causes a problem with the adrenals. I mean, those things can do that, yes. But things like taking in coffee or a pre-workout, that's not going to do that at all. So when people talk about desensitizing from this type of thing, they say, hey, look, I've been taking more and more and more caffeine. I want to be able to get the same effects, but I'm kind of getting to the point where like I'm taking like 400 milligrams of caffeine a day and I'm constantly drinking coffee just to stay up. What you should do is you should titrate down. And what that means is if you're taking 400 milligrams now, maybe take 350 next week or 300 next week. And then the week after that, 250 or 200, and then slowly work your way down to like nothing. What'll happen is those adenosine receptors will downregulate. And so less of them will be grabbing the caffeine because less of them are needed. And eventually, after 3 or 4 weeks or so of being off, you are going to start to feel better and better whenever you take caffeine back in again. It's going to start to work at lower and lower dosages. Now, the reason that I say to titrate down is because if you try to go cold turkey, you're going to have those side effects that people call like adrenal fatigue and stuff like that. All of a sudden, your body's going to, you're going to have headaches and you're going to feel really, malaise and brain fog and all those different types of things. And that just has to do with how the adenosine receptors work. It's nothing to do with the adrenals. So, um, adrenal fatigue, not real. Titrate down if you want to. If the caffeine that you're having is working at the dosages that you're taking and you're perfectly fine and comfortable with the dosages that you're taking, you can stay at it. It's not going to hurt you, assuming that it is not like excessive dosages. For most people, I would say try to keep it between 200, 250 milligrams per day. If you're going significantly above that, I mean, you're probably at the point where maybe we should work down a little bit. And I know that that's going to be a lot, surprising for some people because there's a lot of pre-workouts out now that have like 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is the legal safe upper intake limit in the United States. But it's funny because like in the 90s and early 2000s, you never really saw more than like 200 or 225, and they kept competing with each other to raise these up, and so people have kind of gotten to these really really high levels that are just not necessarily needed. So if you need to, it's probably best to work your way down from there. Recommended sets per muscle group per week. So we've talked about this. We've touched on this a little bit before. Um, I'm making notes about this because I'm actually putting these up on YouTube um, with some of the topics that we talk on. Um, when we've talked about this before, I've said 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week. What people don't really realize when we talk about this in the literature is that 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week means fractional sets. And this is what really confuses people, and it's also what causes people to have these training routines that are excessively volume heavy, like very, very high volume. Fractional sets, when they talk about this in the research, include any exercise that uses the muscle even as like a secondary mover. So bench press would count as sets for triceps. Back row would count as sets for biceps. Now it depends on how they're doing the fractional sets, but typically the fractional sets will count as like one half. So if I was going to do like a bent over barbell row, that would count as like one for back and half. Each set would count as one for back and half for biceps. So if you look at the training protocols and we're talking about this, maybe you're not hitting these 10 to 20 perfect working sets per muscle group per week um, in every training cycle. But you're going to be through a variety of different training cycles being close to doing this most of the time. And any deficiency in one cycle, you're going to pick up in another cycle. So I wouldn't start to like look at every cycle and say, hey, I need to micromanage this to make sure that I'm getting 10 to 20 every single time. But you should be hitting things relatively frequently with the understanding that fractional sets are coming into play whenever you're doing volume counting for these types of things. I would also, when I'm doing this, count hamstrings and quads as different muscle groups. Now, it's really funny because people will always count biceps and triceps as different muscle groups, but they'll never count hamstrings and quads as different muscle groups, even though they have like nearly identical actions, just in a different limb. And so a lot of times people, when I give this talk and then, a client of mine will say, hey, well, I looked at, my training volume and my legs are like 35 sets. It's like, no, it's not. You've got, split that in half and you've got half of these are hamstring, half of these are quad. And unfortunately, in the majority of people, they tend to be very, very quad heavy and almost no hamstring related movements in their training. So we usually see very big deficiencies in people's hamstrings, and that's not a good thing from an injury perspective, from a, hey, your legs look really good perspective. And then a lot of those hamstring movements tend to be really good for the glutes too. And so particularly if you're interested in looking good in jeans, you probably want to maintain some good hamstring movements in training, and that's why we put a lot of them in the Iron Core setup itself. Do I personally hit traditional sauna? No, I don't. Saunas are fine. If you enjoy them, if you like the emotional benefits from them, that's perfectly fine. I mean, if it's relaxing, that's great. The benefits for sauna, I am pretty convinced are pretty cool. If you've got cardiovascular disease and you can't work out, I think that it's great. If you can work out, working out supersedes all the benefits of sauna, including some of the cardiovascular benefits that they tend to claim. And actual cardio has a lot more benefits beyond what sauna provides. So if you really want to spend that time well, you're going to spend 10 minutes in the sauna, you would get a lot more benefits spending 10 minutes going for a jog or biking or something like that. So, hop on the stationary bike and do that instead, and it's going to be a much better life for you. Um, can I skip deadlifts? And is Jefferson curl a decent substitute? There are no specific exercises that are required for anything unless you participate in a sport that requires those exercises. So if you say, I hate doing deadlifts, but I like doing Jefferson curls, and if you're not sure what a Jefferson curl is, it's essentially like a deadlift where what you do is you completely round your back over and bend all the way down and then completely flex your back up. It's kind of like a wave where you're actually rounding intentionally, and it's a great movement. It's awesome for back health and back strength. Um, I love Jefferson curls. Actually, I had a double spinal herniation in 2020, and Jefferson curls was one of the things that I attribute to my healing so well. Um, can you skip deadlifts and do Jefferson curls? Yes, you certainly can. As long as you have some other movements in play that can decently hit the hamstrings. I mean, maybe you just don't do deadlifts, but instead you do, seated leg curls or lying leg curls or Nordic curls or something else. Yeah, you can skip deadlifts. I mean, there's nothing specific about deadlifts that means you have to have that in a training cycle, unless you're a powerlifter and you need to be able to do deadlifts, because the only way to get specifically good at deadlifts is to do deadlifts. But there's a lot of movements that will carry over to bigger, stronger hamstrings, bigger, stronger back, more injury resistance to your spine. There's a lot of things that can do that. So then you find the things that you like. And if, deadlifts aren't your cup of tea, you're probably wrong, but you can make that choice. Is body weight adequate for muscle building as long as you progressive overload? Well, that's kind of the catch-22 there. You can't progressive overload forever if you're just using body weight. That's kind of the issue. And so when people first start out and they see these um, online calisthenics and plyometrics dudes, plyometrics is a little bit different, but we see these like calisthenic dudes that are running around in like jungle gyms and stuff like that. If you look at Olympic gymnasts, they do a lot of weight training. They don't have those bodies just doing gymnastics. Now, a lot of it's due to the gymnastics, but they don't just do that. They do a lot of weight training. And they do that because just the gymnastics alone do not get you to where you want to be with optimal health and optimal physique and optimal strength. And the issue with body weight movements is that there are certain ways that you can make body weight movements more difficult, but you're not going to have as much control over that as if you're lifting weights themselves. So if you like calisthenics, certainly do that. That's completely fine, but it's probably in your best interest to actually have some weight training involved as well, because it's going to allow you to use progressive overload much more efficiently, and you'll be able to track it much more easily because it's really easy to objectively track, hey, I lifted 150 pounds on whatever this lift is. It's more difficult to track, hey, I held out a little bit longer on this plank or whatever it is, if you're doing body weight workouts. So I would be very careful about thinking, okay, well, body weight workouts are going to work for me forever, because they probably won't unless you have very low expectations for where you can take your physique. Is there such a thing as going too low for squats? Um, yes, but that's going to be based on the individual. So the answer for squats and how you should be doing squats is you should go as low as you can comfortably go that your mobility allows. That's just a general rule. Any movement, actually. If you can take a movement a little bit deeper and you're comfortable in doing it and your mobility allows it, you should probably go to end ranges of motion unless otherwise specified, because we're doing it for a training reason. Um, could you go too low in a squat? Yes, you can, but But the only way that you can do that is if you're going beyond where your mobility comfortably allows, and it's putting you into a compromised position. So for somebody like me, who my femurs are too long, I have too narrow hips, I cannot go ass to grass in my squat, and I never will be able to because of um, just the way that I'm built. I'm not built for it. I'm not, built like an Asian lifter. And this is not like stereotyping. It literally is a genetic difference. There's a reason that the Chinese and the Koreans are extremely good at Olympic weightlifting. Chinese, Koreans, Baltic, white people have different bone structures. They've got much shallower hip sockets, and it allows them to get into these positions. And so you'll see a person that can get really, really deep into these squats and not realize, okay, well, I've got that bony inhibition, and that's why I can't get down into it. And so there's a problem there. And so just go as deep as you can, wherever it can allow. Specifically in Iron Core, if you're an Iron Core group fitness person, take advantage of us in the form check area, because a lot of times we can tell you why you're not able to get as deep as you think that you should with some form checks and give you some improvements there, and then you can get as deep as your body will allow. We can't beat biology, but we can make it optimal for you. So take advantage of that. Um, is creatine as big of a deal as it's being made out to be, especially for women? Yes. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. I will say that the reason that I did want to address this, I know that we've addressed creatine in the past, but I did want to address this because you may find, both men and women may find, there is a brand new study out of University of New South Wales, literally within the past month. And the study title says is that creatine doesn't work. They said that, they looked at it in a study, and that people that were on creatine versus people that were not on creatine, there was no difference in the lean muscle gains that they made. Under the study conditions that they had there, they're 100% right. The problem is this study is a masterclass in how to not set up a study correctly. And unfortunately, they like news agencies are running with this. And I was sent this article a couple times, and it's really funny because when you look at the study, you're like, holy shit, if I wanted to make creatine look like it didn't work, I would set it up this way. So it almost looks like either the researchers had an axe to grind, or they just weren't very versed on how to set up exercise training and that kind of thing. And so the issues that they had with this study was they had a massive range in the ages. It was between age 18 and 50. And like, if you get more people on like the 50 end in the creatine group, well, yeah, they're not going to gain as much as the 25-year-olds that are in the non-creatine group. And so that was a big confounder. Then they only chose untrained people, which is another big confounder. If you only choose untrained people, literally anything makes a person grow when they first start out. So the fact that you have newbie gains can overshadow any of the benefits of creatine. And the study was only 12 weeks. So within the first 12 weeks of a person training, which was every one of the people in this study, newbie gains can completely wash out any benefits that creatine could have, because newbie gains are far more significant than creatine will ever be. That's just the way that it is. And so the study parameters that they chose for this were really, really bad. And then on top of it, the average calorie intake for the athletes was 1,600 calories per day, which is excessively low for most men and maybe low for most women that are trying to build muscle. And then the average protein intake was like 70 grams of protein per day. So they put these brand new people in training that were not eating any calories, that were not eating any protein, and they were like, look, nobody gained any muscle. And it's like, no shit. You put a study together where nobody was going to gain any muscle anyways. It was super small, the amount of lean mass that was gained. And so then their conclusion was creatine doesn't work. And it's like, well, maybe if you would have put people in conditions where like they could have gained and then like controlled for the age groups, like if we're going to look at like 50-year-olds versus 18-year-olds, why don't we look at a higher sample of just 20 to 30-year-olds, or a higher sample of just 40 to 50-year-olds? That'll tell us a lot more. And then please, let's do it in somebody that's outside of their newbie gains area to be able to tell what the creatine is doing and not what the newbie gains are doing. And so it became such a big um like slop fest of like terrible study design. It was almost like, well, were these people even trying? And it's hard to see if they were. And this is one of those big things. Um, when you look at studies, um, just because a conclusion says something doesn't mean the study actually says that. And it's really difficult to explain this to people that have really never looked at research before, because you would think, well, it's peer reviewed, right? So that means that the conclusion that it says should be practically relevant. They don't check for practical relevance. Under the study conditions that were used, it showed no gains for creatine. That's correct. And that's what the conclusion says. Creatine was not shown to build more lean muscle because of the study conditions that they chose, not because it doesn't do it anything for anybody, but because if you choose the way that they chose to do it, you're not going to see it. And so they left that part out, but that part is not given in, that part is not required when you're publishing a study. It's not required by peer review. It's not required by anybody. They just have to say, okay, based on this information, can we make a statement and can we at least even like remotely claim that this is true? And there was a previous study, a systemic review a couple years ago, where they claimed that the influence of creatine was very, very small in the conclusion, but if you looked at the data, it said that it increased muscle building by 33%. Now, I would think that if you build 3 pounds of muscle without creatine, and if you were on creatine, you build four, that would make it so I would want to take it because having an extra pound of muscle after only building 3 pounds is pretty significant. But to the study authors, they claimed that that was very small just because, from a relative sense, that's what they claimed was very small. So to them, unless it was steroid gains, it didn't mean anything. And so this got circulated around. So you've got to be very careful with research. And I know that this is kind of getting preachy on creatine, but these are really good examples of what we see a lot in research. And one of the reasons why you might see when Beth and I are talking about things, when you guys ask questions, we might have a different take than a lot of the other, maybe researchers or influencers out there or coaches out there. Ask us for clarification on why, and we can explain why our viewpoint differs with somebody else because maybe they don't realize the error that they're making. Maybe they read this study and it says in the conclusion, creatine doesn't work, and they don't know how to read studies very well. And I've seen a lot of PhDs that don't know how to read studies, and they will give you an inaccurate interpretation of the study, and people run with it. And it makes a lot of waves. If we made another study and it said creatine works, nobody would pay attention. If we make a study and says creatine doesn't work, everybody pays attention because there's 1,000 studies that say it does work. And so this one that says that it doesn't, you're going to pay attention to. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing with creatine today because of the study in the past month. Okay. Beta-lactoglobulin as a protein source. This is coming up a lot because a bigger company has started pushing a protein shot that uses beta-lactoglobulin. Now, beta-lactoglobulin is a viable source of protein. It is when you have like a whole protein and you use filtration methods, you can get different lactoglobulin mixtures. Beta-lactoglobulin is one of the mixtures that you can get. The reason that we've never seen a whole lot of beta-lactoglobulin sources out there in the past is because it's typically one that you probably don't want to mass produce. It's perfectly fine for many people. The problem with beta-lactoglobulin as a source of a protein is that it has a much higher rate of allergens. It makes a lot of people are allergic to it, a pretty significant portion of people, much more significant than other lactoglobulin sources. And so the reason that most people have never used this protein source is because it's just one, it's not superior in any way to other proteins. So like a standard whey protein, concentrated standard whey protein isolate, they all do the exact same benefits as like the beta lactoglobulin source ones. But the beta lactoglobulin one, if you take the protein shot made by the company that does it and you start to experience some allergy type like side effects, it's because they've chosen beta lactoglobulin. And it's not going to do it to everybody. It's not going to do it to the majority of people, but it does do it to a significant portion of people. And I don't know why they chose it specifically. Maybe they got a good deal on the sourcing for it because most of the time, if you're using something like cross-flow microfilter filtration, it actually keeps some of this out intentionally. So it's easier to digest for most people. If you use like ion exchange, which is the cheaper form of filtration, you'll get a higher beta lactoglobulin mixture. But it's funny because in the past, the fact that a product had less beta lactoglobulin was actually a selling point. And now for this product, it is its selling point that it has a lot more of this. But it's a fine protein. And so if you enjoy it, it's fine. It's from what I've seen, the companies that use this, they kind of upcharge for it, so it's more expensive. It's not any better from a result standpoint. It might give you some allergies, but if you like the taste and whatever, I mean, that's perfectly fine. Just be very conscious of what it is and the fact that it's not some kind of like superior new form of protein. It's actually an old form of protein, and we had traditionally kind of not used it intentionally. So, um, if I start taking an omega-3 supplement, should daily fat intake be lowered? I mean, omega-3 is fat, so it's essentially a fat supplement, so it's going to have some calories, and you can adjust for how many calories that omega-3 source has. Now, if you look at the resources section that we have in Mighty Networks, where we have our supplements, we actually have one that has a very high EPA and DHA because, as I've mentioned before, the omega-3 number on your omega-3 supplement doesn't matter at all. That's not the active ingredient. The active ingredients that we are looking for are EPA and DHA. You want a 2 to 5 gram dose of EPA plus DHA per day, preferably a 1-to-1 mixture of EPA to DHA or higher. You want more EPA than you do DHA. DHA is great if you are a child or a mother that's about to have a kid because DHA is great for like fetal brain development, for childhood brain development. EPA becomes more beneficial for adult humans as we age. And so DHA still has a lot of benefits, but we want to kind of weight that ratio more towards EPA whenever we can. And there's confusion in a lot of instances. Like if you talk with your doctor, they'll say, "Oh, well, we've seen studies and taking a fish oil doesn't seem to give the benefits that we once thought it did." The American Heart Association still recommends omega-3 fish oils. And the reason that they do, and the reason that there's confusion about this with your doctor, is because there are studies that show that if you're taking a fish oil, most of the time it doesn't work. But that's because most of the fish oils on the market don't have enough EPA and DHA. And the studies that actually have a high amount of EPA and DHA, particularly EPA, we see much more reliable beneficial results. So those studies like the Reduce It trials and some of those tend to show that fish oils are very, very beneficial. And so if you are somebody that's on the fence about it and have heard from your doctor that this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, that is probably why they're saying that, because they can certainly point you towards studies that show, hey, this fish oil doesn't work. But it's typically studies that just get a blanket fish oil and then they only look at the omega-3 number. So they're like, oh, well, we've got this fish oil that has 2,000 milligrams of omega-3, but then they don't even remotely mention what the EPA and DHA amounts are. And most fish oils on the market are underdosed for EPA and DHA. So if you've got any question about what to get, go to that supplement section in the Mighty Networks resources section. We've got those recommendations there specifically because it's not going to be a waste of your money. Plus, there's that discount code which can help you out as well. Okay, one more. Um, what's best for deadlift, tap and go, or to reset each rep? This is a really important question. And I wanted to touch on this because I think that this is one of those questions that people don't know that they should be asking. Um, when you do deadlifts, you should always reset. Unless you're doing some kind of sport that requires you to do deadlifts as fast as possible. And then if tapping is allowed, you use the tap. So the reason that I bring that up is because sometimes you'll see CrossFit and they'll be like, okay, we'll do 25, reps of deadlift. If they allow tapping, then tap, because if you're going to reset each time, you're going to really be far behind. But if you're trying to get the benefits for physique, for strength, for injury resistance, reset each time. Don't use that momentum or that bounce to power you through the movement, because what you're doing is you're essentially taking benefits away from your pulling strength off the ground. And when you have to pull something off the ground in real life, is it going to be bouncing? Probably not. So take full advantage of that when you can, because it's going to allow you to progress a little bit better. You're probably going to have to suck up the ego a little bit because you're not going to be able to do as much weight, because when you're resetting each time and you're losing those benefits of momentum out of what is potentially the hardest part of the pull right off the ground, you're not going to be able to lift the same amount of weight for 5 reps as you were before, and that's okay, because the important thing here is that we're challenging your musculature and your body more even if you're lifting less weight. So if we were going to talk about what's beneficial for your body, stop and reset. And even if you're somebody that's really focused on, hey, I want to have the biggest 1 rep max possible, you're going to be doing your 1 rep max off of a dead stop. So this is the way that you really train that up anyways. So if you're ever doing deadlifts and you're not doing it in a competition type setting or for that, type of outcome, don't do the touch and go. It's just going to take away from your adaptations from training. Okay, guys, that is it for today. If you have any other questions, feel free to list them in Mighty Networks at any time, and I will get this posted up as soon as possible. I'll see you guys there.